right? I got up at least on time this time. Well, I mean, you only got a week and a half worth of all this left, so last class, we talked about specifically Christian marriage or Catholic marriage, how it is brought about. What is it that it is doing? What is it accomplishing that is different or more unique to it compared to kind of natural marriage? Marriage is just instituted, naturally between us. But what is the ultimate goal of marriage? What are the two ends of either marriage, natural or sacramental, supernatural? What are the two ends of marriage, two goals of marriage? Anybody? Nobody remembers? Nobody wants to be bold? The union of the couple, procreation and rearing of children. In other words, it is there to establish the family. It is there to establish the family. Why is this so important? Because the family is the building block of society. As it is for families, so it is for everything else. Because the family is the most fundamental reality that we encounter as human beings. It is the place where we begin to learn what it means to love and to be loved. It is also meant to reflect the church. It's meant to reflect the community of Christ. Each family is called, as it were, to be a domestic church, or the church at home. This is how family is so important for human beings, more so than other creatures. There are various animals with family-type structures, but none as intimate and intricate as the human family. The purpose of marriage is establishing families. It is there to help secure, to strengthen that which builds up human society, human civilization. If families are not doing well, society is not doing well. So it is that all of this is meant to eventually lead to the family. The parents and the children. Now, obviously, with those ends of marriage, the focus is not on one over the other, especially in Catholic sacramental marriage. It's not that this one is first or that this one is first. Most normally think Catholic marriage is focused on that. Catholics seem to have a greater propensity for having children versus other groups. A great example showing that was a spoof song done by the British comedy group Monty Python about the time that Paul VI wrote Humanae Vitae concerning human life that we looked at far earlier. The title of the song is Every Sperm is Sacred, filled with the two main singers surrounded by vast rooms of children, so as to imply that all Catholics care about, it seems, is just having kids, just popping them out one after the other, almost like rabbits. That's not the primary goal of sacramental or Catholic marriage. That is not the primary goal at all. It is both together. The whole reason why perhaps Catholics seem more focused on it is that greater understanding and appreciation of the gift of the self that is offered in that conjugal act, and the openness to what it leads to. The conjugal act is meant to do both things: unite the couple and bring about a child. To deny that, to reject that, is to abuse and misuse the conjugal act, whether in marriage or outside of marriage. And of course, doing that outside of marriage has the old label of fornication. But this can still happen even inside of marriage. We over-prioritize one over the other, usually the union over procreation and rearing. Couples will say, well, we're not ready, we're not in the right situation. The whole idea of family planning comes to mind. People want to be stabilized or situated in a better place. So they strive to plan ahead, to plan around what they can do. But often in doing that, what happens is they choose one over the other. Instead of perhaps holding off, tempering, or restraining themselves, they say, no, I want to focus on one or the other. It is in the midst of this that we see, of this idea, that we see the practice of contraception. What is supposed to be the purpose of contraception? What's its stated goal? To prevent conceiving a child. It is meant to prevent the conception of a child. Yet that is one of the most fundamental purposes behind the conjugal act. Now, some will try to say some will try to argue, well, this is a newfangled thing. We've only, in the last century or last 50 years, whatever time period they give, we've only been able to do that recently. No. The practice of trying to prevent conception, of practicing some form of contraception, is ancient, albeit perhaps not as successful as more modern means. We have records from Greco-Roman times of prescriptions or recommendations for preventing this to happen. It has only been with the breakthrough of stabilized production of products that what's the word I'm looking for? That don't allow fluids to pass through. Even bigger, the production of drugs that help make it easier to happen. The pill, right? The pill in the 60s, late 50s and the 60s, was the great advent of modern contraception. What this has led to in many mindsets today is to separate these two in carrying out the conjugal act, whether in marriage or outside of marriage. To say that all that really matters is the union of the couple. And when they are ready, then they can procreate as much as they want. First and foremost, it is irresponsible because there is no method of contraception that is 100% effective. None. And the pill, nor any sort of condoms or IUDs or anything like that, none of them are 100% effective. There's only one method that is 100% effective to prevent pregnancy. Abstinence. It's the only method that is 100%. You absolutely want to make sure that pregnancy does not happen. You don't do it. You don't want a gun to go off in your hand? Don't fire it. Don't shoot it. Not only that, though, it is increasingly becoming apparent that the use of these modern methods of contraception have a very adverse effect on those who take it. In particular, of course, women. Did you know that most methods of contraception are actually considered a carcinogen? They lead to an increased risk of cancer, especially breast cancer in women. They also make it harder to be able to be pregnant. Numerous women who have been on some form of the pill for years, then finally get off of it and try to become pregnant, and they find it's very hard, sometimes impossible, to do so. It's also beginning to have an increased impact on our environment. Why? Because most of these forms of contraception involve an increased amount, an artificially increased amount of hormones, especially usually for women, estrogen. The body tries to push that out as much as possible. Biologists and scientists are noting increased levels of estrogen in many of our water systems, which have an impact on the ecosystems. Large populations of fish, for example, are more and more female. One cannot separate the two ends of marriage from the ultimate symbol or act of marriage, the conjugal act. Hence, why it is first and foremost, this is meant to be kept within the confines of marriage. It is not meant to be done outside of that. Why? Because it is the full sign, the full act of that union of the couple that begins on the wedding day. That is meant to grow in being married, naturally or sacramentally. But ultimately, it leads to the denigration of one end over the other. In our current context, usually the union over procreation and rearing. However, more often than not, it involves the harming of human life. These contraceptives, many times, do not actually prevent contraception, do not prevent conception. More often than not, what they prevent is the continuation of the pregnancy. The basic way a woman becomes pregnant is because the conceived embryo clings to the uterine wall and begins to develop and grow. How everything forms, that's basic biology. What the contraceptives do is prevent that embryo from remaining attached to that wall. They don't actually stop that embryo from being conceived. What they prevent is that pregnancy actually coming to term. So then, within the midst of the regular cycle or whatnot, the embryo is flushed out and perishes. Is not able to develop into a fetus, and then develop into a child and then be born. Now, of course, many will take the extreme means to prevent a pregnancy, or to stop, I should say, a pregnancy. Start to prevent it when it's already happened. To say that one is not ready for this child to come, so let's get rid of it. Catholic morality is fundamentally opposed not only to contraception, but of course also to abortion. Why? First and foremost, because it is an innocent human life. It has committed no crime, nothing truly against society. It does not deserve to die. And yes, based on science, biology, it is a human being. Why? The most basic thing that makes us unique individual human beings is our DNA. The basic structure that basically tells us what we are, our genes, right? Not our blue genes, obviously. But our genetic structure that is founded on our DNA. From the beginning, from the very moment of conception, when the sperm and the egg come together and the embryo begins, you have your DNA. It's there from the start. Some will try to use the phrase, my body, my choice, in arguing for the merits of abortion. When in a certain sense, it's not actually your body. It is somebody else's body. There is another human being living inside of its mother. Completely, of course, dependent on its mother. But still a human being, at least in potential. If not even in actuality of existing and developing. But perspective of Catholic morality on both abortion and contraception is that both are gravely immoral and evil, and are not permissible for their intended purposes ever. Now, some will ask and argue about taking a contraceptive for another purpose. For example, there are some medicines that women may take for certain issues that they may be having that may have a contraceptive effect. That is permissible to do because the main purpose, the main goal of the medicine is not the contraception. It is to trying to heal or recover the body. Remember, we always need to look at and understand the intention behind anything that is done. So there may be some limited circumstances that taking something with a contraceptive effect may be permissible. But its main purpose, its main goal is not the prevention of pregnancy at that point. To take something specifically and targetedly for the purpose of contraception is always and everywhere immoral. Just as the process of abortion is always and everywhere immoral. Why is it what can lead some women to desire to make this ultimate decision with abortion. Many times they're forced into it, coerced into it. Sometimes drugged against their will by some man, a father, a boyfriend, a husband. Sometimes because they feel the outside pressure to have to do it, whether from those near to them or just society. Yet there are no circumstances that would legitimately, morally permit this to happen. Hence why it is Catholics regularly protest and make peaceful protests and peaceful pursuits of overturning laws providing for abortions. Yeah.
What if the mother was going to die if she went through with the birth?
What happens? Whose life is more important?
I would say the mother's.
They're both human beings, right? So the question becomes at that point, someone is going to die. And you have to sit there and make that decision.
At that point, it would be like you have to weigh in like what are the chances of a baby surviving to a year old? Because at a year old is when like looks like birth problems can have a lesser effect on surviving when they go older. So like you have to see will the baby survive that long?
But at that point, we're still dealing with, what we're still dealing with is the potential of loss of either human.
Yeah. Modern medicine is good enough.
Well, medicine can only go so far, even as far as our medicine has gone. It can only do so much. It can only be able to act and do so much. So at that point to say, do we allow things to just take our course or do we intervene? And that's, you have to weigh all the merits of everything before you can make that final decision. Sorry.
So I was taught that in that situation, if you had to make a choice, the correct choice would be to treat the mother, and if the baby ends up dying in the process, then it's not morally wrong, because you're trying to save the life of one with the intention of maybe the other would be saved as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because the kid needs the mom to stay alive anyway.
Well, I mean, depending on how far along the fetus is, it could be born prematurely. That's what I mean. There's a lot of variables that have to go into that to understand that. But yes, kind of the general principle is you try to treat the mother as much as possible.
Or you could go the St. John Mola route and just like end up having your kid, and then you give it yourself and end up dying.
Well, I mean, greater love than this no one has than to lay down their life for one's friends, for one's loved ones. So, but in all of those, we are still striving to save the life of all involved, to not just push them aside. Now, some will see this as being patriarchal. Well, just men forcing themselves on women, not understand the situation at all. How can they make this decision for women? How can they make this decision for all of them? Well, because it involves everyone involved. There are plenty of women who have gone through this and have been racked with immense guilt and sorrow at what they did to their children. And many who take the ultimate step themselves, committing suicide because of what they did. It also is a tool that empowers awful men to impose themselves on women. How? Because they can force themselves in this sexual manner on them, and if pregnancy happens, they just take him to the clinic and it's all over. Instead of being responsible as they should be, they are able to be abusive and using of the woman. And actually, both of these, contraception and abortion, do that. In a time without both of these, or without the efficient methods of doing either of those, men have to be responsible to women. They can't use them just for their own pleasure. But with the rise of these, there's been a rise in the abusive power of men. Not all men, I want to make that clear. I'm not saying every single man. But that it imposes more of that carnal desire. Because now we can say, well, we don't have to have this happen at all. It's just that. And if that's easy, then I want it. So while some will argue that this supposedly freed women, on the contrary, it has made them greater slaves to sexual drives and sexual impulses, and men as well. Because it turns women into being only means of satisfying the flesh. Sorry, let me plug this in real quick. The whole point of the conjugal act is to strengthen, to solidify, to affirm both ends of marriage. The unity of the man and the woman, and the openness towards what it is God ultimately desires to do in that, to bring about the family. Does this mean then that one always has to act in this way, and always must, no matter what, cause a child, have a child, be the product of that conjugal act? Not necessarily. So in having sacramental marriage, the Catholic Church does not mandate or give a bare minimum or anything like that for how many children a family is to have. The couple does not approach the priest as they're preparing and goes, well, you now have to have 5 children. You get 3 and you get 10. It's not how it works. A couple can exercise prudence if their situation, if the way they are, where they're at and whatnot, is not the best for having a child at this moment, without resorting to destructive, immoral, and harmful means like contraception and abortion. One can engage in what is known as natural family planning. And what is natural family planning? Recognizing that in the regular cycle of a woman, there are the periods where she is the most fertile and the periods where she is least fertile. The times when that happens. By understanding, observation and experience, when those points are occurring, to engage in that conjugal act at these periods, these times of least fertility. It first of all requires one to still be open to children. Why? As I said before, no method is 100% effective outside of abstinence. You do not want children, don't do it. So engaging in this, there still is an openness to procreation. But using prudent means of understanding when that time of least fertility is happening, so as to engage and to act in that time period. It also requires temperance. Say to yourself, I can't do it whenever I want. Which in a way is having respect for the spouse and even respect for yourself, that you are not just someone led by your passions. There are multiple methods of how to do this. I think the older one was called the rhythm method. There are some other ones, I think the Creighton model and things like that. I'm not going to go into all the details of all of those. But the biggest thing is that it uses that natural cycle. So it introduces nothing harmful and ineffective, or detrimental to one's body. And it allows one to understand how their own body works. And to go from there. That is a means that many couples have used to be able to plan appropriately as best as possible. Like I said, it's not 100%. One can still get pregnant sometimes. More often than not, because they thought they were kind of down here, but they might have been more of kind of in the middle here. They couldn't hold themselves back. Like I said, you still must be open in the use of this method. Open to whatever may come. Now, what about the artificial means of making this happen outside of the normal physical act? Things such as in vitro fertilization, which literally means, the in vitro is Latin. It means in the tube, in the container. What happens with in vitro fertilization is that sperm is acquired, an egg is acquired, and in some means outside that, in the in vitro, the beaker in the tube, they are put together. Sometimes this used to be called, I don't know if it's still called like this sometimes, the forming of test tube babies. Methods such as in vitro fertilization are also considered gravely immoral as well. Why? Because they ultimately deny the unitive aspect. They exist there merely for procreation. And again, both ends together. There's not one over the other. They are equal and necessary in both. Not just for the conjugal act, but for marriage in and of itself. And these can have a very detrimental effect as well. One method is often to inseminate multiple eggs and to dump them into the woman, hopeful that some of them will cling to her and develop. How many of you ever heard of Octomom? A woman, I want to say probably within the last 10 or 15 years, I believe is the record holder for having birthed the most children at once. She birthed 8 children. Like, she became a minor celebrity because of it. That didn't happen by natural means. That happened by that process I just said. And she had multiple eggs fertilized. I don't know if necessarily the same donor or father, or whatever language. But 8 of them clung to her and they developed. I believe the most that has naturally occurred is, I want to say, quintuplets. I don't believe anything beyond that has been done naturally, as in a woman gives birth to 6, 7, or 8, developing in the natural process. All of them have happened by this process of just dumping embryos in. It's like all of them just cling at once. She was a single mother, by the way. I don't believe she was married. I don't believe she's still even married now. But these types of methods are also gravely immoral. As is a method of surrogacy. In a surrogacy pregnancy, again, egg and sperm fertilized outside, but then implanted in another woman. Not the actual mother, not the one from whom the egg came, in another woman. I believe Kanye West and Kim Kardashian did that for their last couple of kids. They did it via surrogacy. I think the most famous example I can think of recently. But this has immense moral issues as well. Why? Because it belittles that other woman to nothing more than a birthing factory. That's all she's good for. And again, separating those two ends. Avoiding the unitive aspect and merely the procreative. It is understandable, the drive, the desire for families. It is understandable. Some people have difficulties. They cannot get pregnant, one reason or the other. But at the same time, respect must be given to that conjugal act. And even more to the creative act which establishes human beings. We are not the masters of creation. We are stewards. And we must treat and respect all of it. If a couple cannot have a child on their own, in the normal method, or a method that even aids but does not replace, which is permissible. You can do something that aids these two ends, but does not replace them. You cannot replace this with the turkey baster or with a test tube. That's not what they're there for. Besides, you can still have, if you are a family and you want to grow your family, you do not just have to have children the normal procreative way. There is always the ability to take one on, to adopt. There are plenty of children who need homes. Yes, they may not be biologically yours, but you may be a far better parent to them than anyone else. And they may be a better child to you than none. But in all of this, striving to recognize, to maintain the dignity of that conjugal act, not to belittle it, not to make it one focus or the other, but to maintain the divine plan for marriage and for the family. Questions, thoughts on any of that? Nothing, Nathan? All right. Read up, keep working. Remember, you've got your virtuous individual project coming up. You do the papers due at the end of the week. So keep working on that. Any questions or any issues with that, let me know. If not, I'll see you next class.